The role of assessment in the learning process can be conceptualised in a variety of ways. These are often described as assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. It's important to note that these are not exclusive descriptions. A single assessment may achieve some or all of those purposes at the same time. Indeed, EAT is based on the assumption that assessment can perform multiple functions and can develop from one purpose to another as it proceeds. Effectively, assessment is learning. It's an integral part of the learning process and should not be seen as separate from it. Firstly, there's assessment of learning, generally referred to as summative assessment. Summative assessment is a type of evaluation used in education to measure a student's overall learning and understanding of the subject or topic. Summative assessment is typically, but not always, administered at the end of a learning period, such as a module or a course, a semester or an academic year. Its primary purpose is to assign marks or grades or to determine the level of achievement reached by a student. Summative assessment can take various forms, including final exams, standardized tests, projects, essays or presentations, and they are used to make judgments about the student's competence or the effectiveness of an educational program. There are two concepts of formative assessment. Assessment for learning is an ongoing and interactive process used in education to monitor and support students' learning during the learning process. Its primary purpose is to provide feedback to both educators and students and to help them understand their current level of understanding and identify areas for improvement. This type of assessment is typically not graded and is used to inform instructional decisions, adapt teaching methods and guide students in making progress. Formative assessment methods can include quizzes or discussions, feedback on assignments, and classroom observations. It's all aimed at fostering a more effective and tailored learning experience. Then there's assessment as learning. This is a concept in education where students take an active role in the assessment process. In this approach, students are not just the subjects being assessed, they may also be learning actively as part of the assessment. For example, by research or inquiry of a new topic. And often they may engage in self-assessment and reflection on their own learning. The primary goal is either to deliver part of the curriculum through the medium of an assessment and/or force students to become more self-aware of their learning progress, their strengths and their weaknesses. They use assessment as a tool for their own learning, personal growth and development. This approach encourages metacognition and helps students take ownership of their learning by setting goals, monitoring their progress and adjusting their learning strategies accordingly. Assessment as learning fosters a deeper understanding of the subject matter and helps students become more independent and effective learners. It also fosters inquiry-based learning, which has more impact and better retention. Again, it's important to note that these characterizations overlap. For example, a summative assessment can have formative elements within it, helping the students benchmark their overall progress as learners. Assessment can be an activity that leads to giving feedback, or assessment can be an activity that can encourage the learner to generate their own feedback insights from the experience. This latter approach may still be summative assessment, but may be very much aligned to the concepts of assessment for or as learning. Students learn through any form of assessment, so assessment is learning. It's important to consider what is the nature of the student role in this. Can we translate the role of the student in assessment into individual perceptions of assessment? The EAT framework focuses very heavily on student agency. So an important perception to evaluate with a student is, do they consider assessment as something done to them or something done for or with them? Assessment done to you is very much aligned with assessment of learning. Assessment that's designed by another person, the educator, for purposes of achieving a grade or mark or evaluation of competence from the learner. The alternative perspective would be assessment that was co-developed with the learner and designed in such a way to provide them with opportunities to display competence and support engagement in their own learning. This approach would still be a summative assessment, but the co-creation element would mean that it's an assessment for or as learning as well. Another key issue is assessment understanding dependent on another or independent and agentic by the learner? Assessment that relies on the intervention of a more knowledgeable other, for example the educator or an expert testing the learner against a standard, versus assessment where the more knowledgeable other and the learner co-create an output that they build together towards an agreed standard. An example of this would be the questioning session or an OSCE, where the learner is being quizzed by an educator or an expert versus the master's or doctoral viva, where ideas are explored and understanding supports the discussion of wider contexts. An assessment can feature both of these depending on the nature of the activities and the complexity or level of the material. In some situations, the learner can experience assessment as an author or contributor to the assessment experience. So you have assessment as a prescriptive activity designed by the educator versus an assessment where the student gets to choose the medium or activity through which they will demonstrate the learning outcomes being assessed. These perspectives link to the idea of self-actualization at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but applied to assessment. So the ability of the assessment to support change in a person, how one thinks, how one acts, does, it's about empowering and enabling the individual to take their learning beyond the immediate assessment point. It's looking at assessment as a change agent in their life and their learning. This concept also links to the self-determination theory of Deci and Ryan. So assessment can cover a number of different activities that are of use to the learner, whether that's assessment of learning, assessment for learning, or assessment as learning. Assessment is a fundamental part of the learning experience, so assessment is learning.